Welcome to another episode of Unscripted, presented by LeaseLock. In this episode, I'm joined by Chris Lema, the CEO of Motivation AI. Now, Chris is probably a new name and face to many of you, but I've had the honor of calling him friend for over a decade. He is a successful entrepreneur, business coach, public speaker, and truly one of the brightest minds I know. His thought leadership is absolutely next level. With the changing landscape around the operational model multifamily, I wanted to share his perspective and experience around virtualizing on-site teams, rethinking the right personnel/position fit, and the importance of identifying and leading teams via their individual motivation profiles, which is a specialty of Motivation AI. Now, we got together at his personal mastermind conference called CaboPress. It's a highly curated event for business owners to share creative ideas to the challenges they are facing today, all conducted from the pool at an all-inclusive resort in Cabo San Lucas. So expect a much more casual look than normal, but I promise you, the conversation is anything but casual and you'll get a ton out of it. But before we jump in, just a reminder that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of LeaseLock. The content is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsements. While we strive to ensure that the content is as accurate and up-to-date as possible, LeaseLock makes no representations or warranties of any kind, expressed or implied, regarding the accuracy, completeness, or reliability of the information discussed. The content is provided as is, and LeaseLock assumes no responsibility for any errors or omissions. Listeners should consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the content of this podcast. This podcast may include references to third-party sources, which are provided for the convenience and informational purposes only. LeaseLock does not endorse or take any responsibility for the accuracy or reliability of any third-party content. In no event shall LeaseLock, its affiliates, or any of its employees, officers, or agents be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, or consequential damages arising out of or in conjunction with the use or the reliance of the content of this podcast. Now, with the highly scripted disclaimer out of the way, let's get unscripted with Chris Lema. Chris, I appreciate you sitting down with me. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to see you.
You as well. So this is a little bit more of a casual episode dress-wise than I typically do. Because I'm here at one of your conferences, CaboPress, which we're going to get into in a little bit. But since you're a name that's relatively unfamiliar to the multifamily space, I've known you for a long time. I appreciate calling you friend. Tell us a little bit about you and what your company does, and I'll kind of dive into why I think this is so pertinent for multifamily.
Sure. I run a company called Motivations AI, and the product is the Motivation Code or the Motivation Code Assessment. And that looks at a completely different approach to personality assessments than the ones that are out there in the market. We don't ask you what you'd prefer to do on a Friday night or anything like that. We look at the stories of your own life that have been deeply satisfying achievement. And then from that, we decode what moves you, what motivates you, how you're wired. And by giving that back to you, we can put a lot more emphasis on how you put that in at work, how you stay fulfilled, how you manage your employees, how you define assignments, all that kind of stuff that ends up being really, really practical and useful.
Awesome. So one of the reasons and thank you for that, I also want to share a little bit about the fact that, you've been a business coach for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And you've seen a lot of different challenges in businesses of all types. Yeah. And one of the challenges that's in multifamily right now that I'd love to get your perspective on is the operating model, especially for on-site teams, is completely changing. The vernacular we use in multifamily often is centralization. I push back against that word simply because every model I've seen is completely decentralized.
That's right.
But it's this idea of role specialization,
yep,
which is one of the things I thought about, especially with Motivation Code, of like, okay, if we're thinking about these role specializations, how do we then think about hiring the right person to put in that right position? Right. And then kind of the idea of, okay, well, what does that look like from a go-forward perspective on a training and development and leadership development? So one of the things I'd love to ask you is I'm big on thinking about unintended consequences. You thought one thing, but then you realize as you get to step D, E, and F that suddenly they're starting to go off the rail.
Yeah.
One of the things you put on your website is like you've done virtualization of work. What are the things people need to be thinking about as we start thinking about these centralizations or specializations that have surprised people in the past?
Well, in the old days, right, big companies, the MCIs, the AT&Ts, the names that they spun up their own universities, right? And so the way they did leadership development or training and development was they literally took a person, and Chick-fil-A still does this to this day, right? If you want to be a GM, you want to own a franchise, but they would move you to one place and you'd spend 6 months there, and they move you to another place, spend 6 months there, and you do that for 2 or 3 years before you graduate AT&T University or MCI University, and then you could get the next job, right? Because they were trying to develop generalists that had broad exposure. Well, today, right, what we see is in the Amazons of the world and the Apples of the world, you have specialists who played in one vein, right? They just did supply chain, or they just did, receivables, or they, whatever the focus is. And then you move them into a leadership role that is more than the leadership of that single skill set.
Right.
And then we're shocked when they quit, right? We're like, what happened? I just gave you a promotion. I gave you more money. I gave you a bigger title. I gave you a car. And they're like, no, you gave me a nightmare.
To put that in multifamily speak, that is the leasing professional becoming an assistant community manager. We take someone who's great with people and we lock them in a back
room. Yep. And they're like, here's a general ledger. Go process all the money. And you're like, why? This is a nightmare, right? So where motivation code fits into that, right, is because we're trying to figure out who you are, how you're wired, absent of everything else. Like, regardless of what you've done in the job, what moves you? What gets you up, right? We tend to talk about motivation as like gas in the tank, it's full or not. It has nothing to do with that, right? We talk about motivation as if, well, what happens when you're not motivated? You just need discipline. And you're like, no, motivation is more like the color of your eyes. It doesn't matter what color your eyes are. It just means that depending on your hair color, your eye color, your height, whoever you are, we need to make sure that we're shaping the job for, what makes you work and what makes you excited, so that you're always excited to wake up in the morning and get to work. That's hard when you're in this transition of going from generalist to centralist, generalist to specialist, right? It is difficult because you're going to end up at a point where you've developed some really great specialists and they're really good at what they do, but someone still needs to be over that.
Right.
So what happens if you take someone who is really good at mitigating risk, evaluating risk, right? Someone who is like an underwriter before you're putting, renters in properties, and they're fantastic. That is predominantly investigatory and mathematically oriented towards, capturing and evaluating risk. When is it good? When is it bad? But that doesn't live in a vacuum. You have to take that person and some others and put some umbrella over it. How do you define the leader for that, right? And how do you make sure that leader is like, I'm excited by this job, and not, what ends up happening is we take one of those guys, right, and we put him in charge, and then the first thing they do is they go to the person who's doing the skill or the task that they used to do, and they start getting in their shorts, right? And they're micromanaging.
Because it's what they know the best.
Because it's what they know the best. So they're the ones that can see the red flags or the issues. And now this person quits, right? Maybe the leader doesn't, but the person's like, this guy doesn't let me do my job. I'm out. So you end up with higher voluntary attrition.
Right.
Most of what we do in leadership and leadership development, right, we're worried about, how do we know when to fire someone? You're like, firing is not the problem. In the United States right now, voluntary attrition is over 22%.
Wow.
That's more than 1 every 5 people who chooses on their own to walk off. Well, why? Because either they're very specialized, and then you put them in a generalized role and they have to cover a whole bunch of skills they've never managed before, and they're like, forget this. Or they're in that role, they're kind of jonesing, they love the fact that I'm in charge of everything, right? But they're micromanaging someone who then says, I can get this job somewhere else, and boom, out the back door. Right.
So I know a lot of folks in our industry who would kill for a 22% attrition rate. I mean, seriously, the average on site is over 50%.
Oh,
it is. This is why I keep coming back to this conversation in these podcasts, is because this is people retention and people attraction has got to be, if it's not number one in our industry, it's a really close number 2 to maybe fraud prevention and bad debt exposure, et cetera.
Yep.
okay, maybe expense control with insurance, but those three are like constantly jockeying for, okay, what's the thing we're the most worried about?
Yeah.
So I guess, when you're thinking that problem through, because I think you nailed on the head of what people are seeing. You've had this specialist, they've been promoted into a new role, they haven't been exposed necessarily to a whole bunch of other things. Or the other one I talked about with you earlier, it's that community manager who's been in a highly specialized organization, now going into a generalist organization going, what the heck?
Yeah.
How do we think about, or how other industries and organizations thought about developing that more well-rounded leader that can step in and be able to succeed in that environment relatively early?
Yeah. I mean, the hardest part is that, today you can do a lot virtually, right?
Yeah.
But you cannot develop experience on a Zoom call.
Okay, give me more on that.
You cannot say, well, we'll just get on 3 or 4 Zoom calls, we'll just talk about it. And you're like, no. The things that shape a person's skill set to succeed is the actual experience. So it's the renter who's walked out on you. It's the person who is trying to get in and they won't call you back. And you have to develop the shortcuts. And you don't get that experience without that experience. There's no shortcuts to that. So you have to build mentoring programs, onboarding programs. You have to build something that gives people that experience. I mentioned Chick-fil-A earlier. Chick-fil-A, now Chick-fil-A University does not guarantee that you get to buy a franchise, but you can't just walk in and buy a franchise. They will be like,
you have to be a graduate.
You have to go through this program. And just because you graduated doesn't mean you get one. It just means we want to make sure that we've put you through this. And so you spend 6 months at a store, and then 6 months at a different store, and then it's 2 years, right? Of 6 months and your family has to move, and you live in a town where you know no one. I mean, it's jarring, but the people who come out of that are like, I've seen now how 4 different locations do customer service, and by the way, they all do it a little bit different. I've seen, and this is the challenge, right? When you go from a specialist to a generalist, and especially if you're changing orgs, right? We tend to think that everything I did here will work here. But the minute you change jobs, companies, cultures, locations, anything, it all changes. So you have to develop the capacity in a person for resilience. Now, that's hard because you don't develop resilience on a Zoom call. You actually have to put people through some effort, training, whatever. And that may mean that you're like, hey, if you don't want to do a 2-year program and move them to 4 times, that may mean, hey, for this week, we're going to send you to this other location, like you'd send someone to a conference. But we're going to put you in deep over there for a week, and then we're going to bring you back, and then we're going to decode what you experienced. And it's like we're sitting here in Mexico. It's like a culture shock when you go to another country for the first time. This place doesn't work the way I want it to work. And you're like, welcome to the stages.
Oh, the property manager in me is going nuts walking around this place. Not because it's not kept well, it is kept very, very well. But it's amazing when there's no OSHA and there's no ADA rules around there. You're like, wait, I'm missing these stairs are really steep and really narrow and all that. I'm like, oh, that's right. Those rules they're not.
There was a guy yesterday that asked me about this property, and it's like, it looks like they have workers here working all the time. And I'm like, yeah, I've been here 20 years. They're always working. Why? Because the way they build this stuff is not the way we would build it in the US.
No.
Now, I can get upset about it, right? If I'm in the first stage of that culture shock, right? But then you start going, oh, but I see why. And oh, I understand, right? And so you have to develop resilience. And so you got to put people in context where they're uncomfortable. But you got to also keep reminding them of why you're bringing them there, right? This is what you're good at. This is what motivates you. This is great. So I'm going to take your super well-honed capacities and skills and experience, and I'm going to stick you in a place that's uncomfortable. But I'm going to tell you ahead of time that it's uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you ahead of time why it's going to be uncomfortable. And then I want you to actually push through it so that we can decode it at the end. And then we're going to debrief it and make sure that we took away the right lessons. Because the worst thing you can do is send people to different places. They come back and their lesson isn't, the Atlanta office works really different than the Houston office. Their takeaway was the Atlanta office is a mess and they suck. Yeah. And you're like, you didn't learn the lesson you need to learn.
So I love the fact that you're going there, because one of the things that I still do, like the organization I started off in multifamily had a very similar approach to what you described with. When I was hired as a leasing manager with Oakwood Worldwide back in the day, I was straight up told, your job as a leasing manager is to learn how to become a community manager. And they also told me, because you can't do that at one particular site there, if you check that little willing to relocate, you are going to relocate. And I was 1, 2, 3, 4. I was on 5 properties within a year where I had an apartment on those before I became a community manager. But what they did so well was what you just mentioned there at the end was, yes, I spent 2 weeks with the maintenance supervisor, did nothing but maintenance. I spent 2 weeks with the housekeeping supervisor, did nothing but that. Spent a month with our housewares department, etc. But I came back and depacked with the same leader every single time, even though I wasn't on their property, etc. And now looking back on it, I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but looking back on it, that was did you learn the lesson that we actually wanted you to learn and expose you to, as opposed to, wow, Oakwood San Lucas is never where I want to go again. Although it was a great property, don't get me wrong. So how do you, again, so all these conversations or all these different universities we've talked about are internal organizations. Have you seen this work from an industry perspective, utilizing external organizations, different external training programs that are focused in it? I'm just curious.
You don't see a lot of programs, but given that I'm a business coach, I know other business coaches, and I know there are people that do that, right? Where they actually say, okay, I want you, we're talking about problem A, but I actually want to take you and have you start working on a situation B, and the executive's like, why? What does that have to do with anything? And then by the time they round the corner and get to the end, they're like, now let's take what we've learned here and bring it back over here. But those are often executive coach scenarios where they're the CEO of an organization, and they just keep seeing, if you're walking somewhere, right, you're heading to a destination, you keep seeing the same tree, it suggests you're not doing something right.
Might be going in circles.
You might be going in circles. And a lot of times, right, that's what I get, right? And several other executive coaches will get that, where you're like, I'm talking to a guy who runs a $2 million to $20 million business every year, and he still sees the same problem over and over. You're like, yeah, if you see that tree more than once, we should sit down and go, hey, what are we doing? So there are definitely coaches that know how to work that through and go, okay, I see what the issue is here now. When you're dealing with executives, getting them to see a paradigm that's different is more work. You got to trick them into it, right? Because they're like, no, I'm good and I have good ideas and my systems work. And you're like, or not, right?
To a point.
To a point. But external training programs themselves, they're hard because more often than not, the ones that do something external, they just want you to go through their system.
Right.
And when you're like, no, I want my team to get equipped for our industry or our programs or our whatever. And this guy's like, I just have a 12-step program for this or 20-step program for this. And so that's harder. The challenge is if you don't get someone who's really committed to, invested in, or delights in mentoring and leading people, then it's going to be a gap. Because if you don't do it inside, and if you even try to do it outside and you're just throwing it over, I'll send my 2 guys over, it didn't work, and I write it off. And you're like, no, this has to become the leading and training and development of people has to become a core value of the business. And unfortunately, you look at most organizations and they all have a poster, and they all have their values, and they all have the little note card, and they have however they do it. And you read through it, almost none of them are focused on leadership development. Almost none of them are focused on people development. They're talking about their bottom line. They're talking about return to their stakeholders. They're talking about the vision. They're talking about how they're going to change the world. And you're like, all of that requires that your people aren't leaving every 18 months.
Yeah.
Right? So you got to invest in people.
Well, the other thing I would tie on there, because again, taking this back to multifamily, we always talk about the 4 Ps in multifamily: product, promotion, price, and people. And people is by far the most important one. But a lot of the organizations that, even if they've got that step past the poster, and it's not just, again, we're going to achieve all the results for our stakeholders, we're here to drive, the profits for our things, they'll have that commentary on the people, but it is often not related to the development and the leadership development that you mentioned. It is, we value our people.
We value our people.
Are all great, and it's true.
Or they say to themselves, we hire the best people.
No.
I can't tell you how many organizations I've been in and how many meetings I've been in where we hire the best. And I'm like, okay, well, first I beg to differ, right? Because I've met some of your people and they're not the best. Doesn't mean they can't become the best.
Right.
But what I would love is not for an organization to say we hire only the best, but rather we develop people into their best selves. Now that's an organization that I'll stick with.
Right. And I can think of a couple that I won't actually put names on here on that I would say that is there. They have an approach of red carpet in and red carpet out.
Yeah.
To quote one that now people who are
they know
exactly which one that is. But let's go back to a little bit of that motivation, because again, the idea that you're going to develop people.
Yeah.
You can't. Can I go back to our traditional model? I can develop a leasing professional into an assistant community manager, and the really good leasing professional who isn't necessarily like career oriented, wanting to go up, they'll be able to make it happen, and they're going to hate their life at that point. Yeah. How do you, as someone who owns a company that has a profile, or at least a CEO of a company that has a profile, how do you think about what's the right seat on the bus for someone to sit in from the structure of code?
So here's the crazy thing, right? If you ever had a boss who was wired completely different than you.
No one's ever had that.
No one's ever had that. They ask you to do something, and they issue the assignment for a simple metaphor. They issue it with one sentence. I would like you to create a memo that highlights a brand new revenue stream that we can, a new offering that will create a new revenue stream for us. One sentence. What ends up happening is the listener of that sentence, right? The employee that works for the supervisor, the employee immediately contextualizes that sentence with an added statement that is, and do it the way I do it, right? There's just an implicit, well, I've seen how my boss does it. He wants me to do that, or she wants me to do that. And I don't know how to do that, or I'm staring at a blank page, or I can't do that, right? If we change from the implicit second sentence, if we articulate a second sentence that is no longer about how I would do it, but rather how you would do it. So hey, Andrew, I want you to spin up a new offering that will generate a brand new revenue stream. And then I break it out 8 different ways, because we have analyzed and determined there's 8 different dimensions of motivation. So someone can be an achiever, a driver, an influencer, a learner, an optimizer, an orchestrator, a relator, or a visionary. And the fact that I did all those in alphabetical order without notes, my whole team is cheering.
Okay, but you also were the person who knew exactly which line on an Excel spreadsheet my last name was yesterday, so you might have a decent number.
So there's 8 different dimensions of motivation, and each one of those people are motivated differently. So for an achiever, I would say, Andrew, I want you to create this memo that does this because I want you to be able to present it to the CEO, or I want you to meet our board and do this. And you are uniquely qualified to do this because of the experience you had over there. And you're like, oh, I could do this all day. If you were a driver, I would say, hey, I want you to create this memo that does this. And I want you to focus on the 4 problems that you've already seen and identified that are problems in our current modeling and fix them in a new model. Oh my God, all I live for is fixing problems. The driver is thrilled to write that memo. If you're an influencer and not the Instagram influencer, right, but in our model, then you want to think about community impact. And so I would say to you, I want you to create a new offering that moves the needle on how we engage our community. Oh, I can do that. But if I tell you, I want you to do this in such a way that moves the needle on the community, and you're a achiever, it doesn't do anything for you. It falls flat. So what we do is we teach people how to add that second sentence, how to shape the assignment. The truth is, I can take someone who is a loan processor, put them into a community manager, but if I shape the job the right way to align with how they're wired, it means I'm going to not have one community manager. I'm going to have 8 versions of that community manager.
So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it this way. You're actually saying that the right seat on the bus is just as much how you are building the seat as it is with the butt that you're putting in the seat.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. The truth is, that normally when you take someone and kick them off the bus, it's because what you really wanted was you have a seat, it has a butt shape in it, and you want the butt that fits that shape. And you want to do it the easiest way possible. So you sit someone in the seat. Oh, the butt doesn't fit, throw them out. Oh, doesn't fit, throw them out. Oh, that fits. You made it easy for you. But if you're in the land of training people, developing people, and you're like, no, my seat is, you know that bed that Tempur-Pedic,
yeah.
right? The seats are made of Tempur-Pedic. Any butt fits in that seat. The issue isn't, right, how your butt fits in the seat. The issue is how well you understand what, the version of what you can bring to that seat in that role.
Okay, so interesting. Go back to specialization then, because you got me. I didn't know we were going to go this direction, but I love it. Going back to specialization, I think so many people, and I know I would have taken this approach. I would have said, okay, great. What are the tasks that are specific to delinquency collection versus renewal processing versus ongoing collections versus whatever, back-end centralization, leasing, et cetera. And I would have thought, what are the personality traits that are needed for that role?
Right.
How would you approach it?
And I'm saying, if I have a high quality individual, they have integrity, all the things we hire for. They're smart, they're committed, they have integrity. Okay. What I'm going to do is first figure you out. And you may be someone who loves to solve puzzles. So the way you approach this may not be the way someone else. I might say, hey, look at all the financials, find the most egregious problems, and let's go solve those. And it may be one out of this column, one out of this column, one out of this column. I'll make money off that. You may not be someone who does that, right? You may be someone who is a little more interested in creating something that you can say, that has my stamp on it. So I may say, hey, I want you to look at all this, but I would like you to figure out how to do risk mitigation in this space. And they're going to be like, oh, well, it's all in this one. It's all in this space, right? It's in the lease ups. We're sitting on properties too long before we put, heads in beds. So let's go do it. And you're like, that's not the way anyone else would have done it. They would have been over here looking at who's leaving and not paying deposit. And you're like, no, but this is a valid way to, again, it's finances. At the end of the day, $1 is $1. If you can find more dollars here than here. So it's about finding who you are. Now, granted, if you're someone who's like, I love people, I love hanging out with people, I'm motivated externally by processing with people, well, I'm probably not going to ever put that person in a back room with a computer to look at a spreadsheet. So it's not to say that every single person can be in every single job. I don't want to make it that extreme. But normally what we see is 3 to 4 different motivations could do any particular job really quite well. But the 4 that could fit in that role are going to do it 4 completely different ways.
Right. And
so it's my job, right? I had 2 product managers, right? So I'm in software. We run a software company. And this was the last one, but I hired 2 product managers in software. And one of them I had doing one set of things and the other a different set of things. So the first one calls me up. Can I have a conversation with you? Yeah. Hey, why is Christine doing this? I haven't been asked to do that. I've never done that. And now she's doing that. And that's a big deal. And I'm like, yeah. Do you want to do that? Like, does that light you up to go do a long contract? No. I can make that. No, I would hate that. Then why are we having this conversation? Right? Because internally what she was feeling is that someone else who has my same title,
quality,
right, is doing something I don't get to do. But when you look at them eye to eye and say, do you want to do what she's doing? No, I love doing what you gave me to do. I'm like, right, because I shaped the job to you, not I shaped you to the job. And so the more you develop that skill to be able to say, no, I can take 2 product managers, stick them here and give you one set of work and you a different set of work. And you're never going to look the same. But what I'm going to get is that extra 20%, right? If everybody's running at some baseline, that extra 20% because you love your job, because it's wired, it's literally shaped for you. You're going to give me not just 100%, you're going to give me 120%. There are people in all of the different jobs that I've put people in and trained them up. There are people who will be working all Saturday and Sunday, and I have to be like, you need to take the weekend off. You need rest. You need a hobby. You need you need other things. Work can't be your whole life. And they're like, no, but I just love this. That's when you know you found the right way to shape the job to the person.
Says the guy who has an entire conference over his vacation in Cabo, but we're going to get to that. But as you were going through that, I really had two kind of strains of thoughts in my mind. The first one, when you're talking about, okay, we need to shape the position in a way that meets the needs of that particular employee, I think is something that a lot of our listeners anyways are going to really value from, because as I've seen organizations go from the traditional operating model into what I'm going to continue to call the specialized operating model, I'm hearing numbers of like 80% are actually coming from internal candidates. So there are people who are already in their organization that are being repositioned to a different spot within the organization and doing that well. The other one I heard more was hiring for the right type of personality for the positions that are actually open. So it was almost like you take one approach for the internal development, we'll say, versus the who's the right person, again, to continue the good to great analogy, to bring on the bus.
Yeah. So I think you have to do both. So what we do, we use Motivation Code for hiring all the time, and we help other companies use them. And what we're looking for is, here's the thing, right? Here's the dynamic that I know you know, right? The phrase that we have all heard is people don't leave companies, they leave bosses, right? But when we hire, most of what we're looking for is skill and experience. So we sit here and we analyze skill and experience. We look over resumes, we have interviews, we get other people to do the interviews. And what are we doing? We're asking all day long about skill and experience. But voluntary attrition is when the employee says, I don't want this anymore, and they leave. And what we're saying, we all know, it's common truth that, they left because of their boss. We spend no time evaluating that mix. So what we do, right, is we do the full M-code assessment for the supervisor, the hiring manager, and then all the candidates. And we literally can map, these folks will do well with this person, and these folks will probably struggle. Really won't.
It's funny. I guess this sounds egotistical. I guess I was a little bit ahead of the game on this one, because for years, decades now, my favorite question to ask people is actually twofold. I always ask someone, who's the best manager you ever worked for and why?
And why? Yep.
And then the one I always follow up with is, who's the worst and why? And I'm like, don't give me your name. Multifamily is way too small.
Yeah, it's too small. I don't want to know their name, right?
I'm like, but describe to me what it is, where you thrive.
Until it's really bad when you hear the story and you know immediately who they're talking about.
That has happened a couple times, actually.
And you're like, oh, God, I know who you're working for.
And it's funny, what would also happen oftentimes was the person who, they would immediately give me the name of they would hesitate on the name of the best, and then they would almost immediately give me the name of the worst. And I was like, God, you got to flip that over around, guys. You got to be a little bit careful about that. Okay, so I got a couple other questions. I'll ask it this way. In your experience, again, I've taken almost all of the assessment tests that are out there. And I will say, not to give it M-code or advertise or anything else, I will say yours is very, very different.
Yes.
It is very different. Again, it's not the 100 questions. Mm-hmm. It's only 5 that you got to think about a whole lot. But maybe more than 5.
It's 4 stories and 32 questions per story.
Okay, I was thinking about the stories.
In the context, it's just a single story, and then you answer some questions. And those questions are easy to answer because they're about the story, which is totally different.
Your experience.
Your experience. Yep.
So with that in mind, what is the way that you have seen personality assessments used incorrectly the most?
Well, almost all of them, right? And you can evaluate this on your own experience, but almost all of them, they ask you a whole bunch of questions, many of which may not relate to your direct experience because it's just a generic set. And so they say, hey, on a Friday night, what would you prefer to do, right? And you have to answer quickly because they just want your gut response. And option 1 is go out on a Friday night with all your friends, get drunk, and end up in jail. Or the alternative is stay at home because you have no friends and read a book. And you're like, okay, first of all, those seem really extreme. Yeah. Right? Second of all, which Friday night are we talking about? Because some Fridays I might want to do A and others B. Third, what's the name of the book? Or, there are people who are like, hold on.
Is it fall? Is it football season in Texas?
Yeah. Is it a weekend? And how long am I going to be out, in jail? There's all these things, and you realize I'll pick one, but it's not true to me. It's just 2 extremes. And then at the end of the assessment, they say something like, you have a goatee. And you're like, how did they know? Because I answered a question about friends or not friends, drinking or reading a book, and they ended with, You have a goatee, or you often interrupt people, and you're like, how did they know? And you're like, that's awesome, great, okay. But also, you read the whole thing, and you're like, yeah, this is about 50% accurate because those questions were really kind of extreme. What I challenge people to do with most assessments is I'm like, just wait 2 weeks and then see if it's done anything for you. And what you discover is they don't have legs. Most personality assessments, the ones that are non-scientific, like Myers-Briggs, or the ones that have some science behind it, like StrengthsFinder, it doesn't matter in any of those that you take, just wait a couple weeks and then see if it does anything. It's horrible. I can't tell you how many people I talked to. I talked to an executive who was a department head in a large organization who had visionary in their StrengthsFinder results and was super bummed. And I'm like, why? I mean, this told you who you are, and visionary sounds like a good thing. He goes,
especially as a leader.
Yeah, and he goes, in my company, in my role, I am charged with executing someone else's vision. So he gets his StrengthsFinder and he takes his first thing and he just throws it away because there is no place in his job, right? And when you're doing a skill-based, a strength-based, skill-based thing, and they say you're good at this, if your job doesn't let you do that, you're just like, get him over, go find a new job.
So again, just personal experience. The first time I went through StrengthsFinders was probably close to 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
And we did it as an organization. It was all the general managers, and we brought all the general managers together and we shared all the results. Mm-hmm. And I will never forget, of all the general managers that were there, I think it was one of two who did not have woo in their thing. Mm-hmm. And woo is so low on mine. I mean, it's like everything and woo. Yeah. And it was just, it made me feel so much like another.
Yeah.
That I don't have the qualifications and the skill set.
How am I going to do this
job?
Yeah. So for us, we're like, no. This, our assessment is uniquely tied to you because it's your stories of achievement. And then we're asking you questions about what made that so moving for you. And then we decode that and we do it 4 times and then we pull it all together. So we're telling you about you. There's no magic to it. You're going to read it and be like, this is me. And of course it's me because I gave you this information, right? So that's part of it. But also we tell you then, right, as you go through the report, how to write about yourself on LinkedIn or how to negotiate with someone if they're in the same motivational dimension or if they're in a different one. We're giving you the legs, the tools to put this to work. And we've seen it happen over and over again. People are like, oh, this not only explains all my past, but it helps me think about my future. It helps me when I hire and when we help other people hire, right away we're like, how are you shaping the job for that person? And the more they do it, the more like, this is great. I'm like, I've been shaping jobs for people for 25 years. I'm telling you, it works. In Silicon Valley, right? And I lived there for more than 10 years. The average at the time when I was, in the Bay Area, and in technology in Silicon Valley, the average was 18 months that an employee stayed working for an employer and for their supervisor. 18 months, and then they were like, I need a raise, I need a job, I need a different, or I don't like this guy, and they move on. And for that 10-year period, my run rate was 6 years. 6 years.
Wow.
I didn't even stay at companies for 6 years, meaning I was at a company for 2.5, then I left and went to another company for another 2, and they came with right? And it's one thing if you're like, well, yeah, Chris, you had 3 employees, 6 years is easy to do if you only have 3 employees. I managed over 100 people over that time period, right? Over 150 people. So you're like, no. The numbers stick, not because I'm special, but because I was shaping the job. The first thing that has to happen, and the first thing that happens with these, with a personality assessment like MCODE is you have to see people for who they are, not who you want them to be.
I'm so glad you said that too. And that they're more than just the assessment.
That's right.
Again, it's great to have these tools, but these tools are exactly that. It is a tool.
It's a tool.
And it's one of a lot of tools you should be looking at and using. Yeah. And to your point, you've got to see the person.
Got to see the person. And once you see the person, then you shape a job for a person. They stick in. They're not going anywhere because they've all had the experiences we've all had and all the people you interviewed, which is what's your worst boss ever. And they're like, oh, I don't know if I can tell you my best, but I can rattle off all my worst, right? Because we remember those. They left an imprint. We went home and we cried or we were frustrated or we wanted to quit or we felt hostage because this is the only job that I have in this town that pays this much and I have a mortgage. And you're like, I don't want any of that. I want you to come to work legitimately because you love your job. And you could, one of the guys that works for me, well, almost all of them that work for me are here. This conference, you can ask Sean, and you can say, hey, how hard are you working? You work for Chris, right? Yeah. How hard are you working? He's like, this is the least amount of work I've ever done. You go, wow. Is Chris just like super easy? He's like, oh, no. He sets the hardest goals and where the needle needs to move than anyone I've ever worked for. Okay, I don't understand. How is he the most stringent about where you're trying to move the needle, and yet this is the easiest job you ever had? He's like, because every single thing I do is in my sweet spot. So the metaphor we use, right? I don't know if you've ever seen this, something called the home run derby.
I have seen the home run derby.
I didn't understand it, right? First of all, I'm not super big into baseball, but second, I didn't understand because I'm like, you're going to pitch to a guy, you're trying to strike him out, and then he's trying to hit home runs. Well, then you watch it, and you're like, oh, no, they're not trying to. The guy is his dad or his pitching coach or his best buddy.
He is trying to get as many home runs as possible.
And so what he's doing is he's throwing to the batter's sweet spot.
Yep.
And that's the metaphor we use at work. Every assignment I give you, I should be trying to pitch to your sweet spot. So if I keep sending you assignments that are right down the lane, oh, you like it low and outside, and I keep throwing that, you keep hitting me out of the park, you're having the easiest job ever, and you're having the most productivity ever. That's where you win.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I made the transition over here to LeaseLock, one of the questions I asked had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who were working here before I came over. I didn't take the decision lightly. And they didn't describe it the way you just did, but they absolutely described it the way you just did, which was kind of the opposite. They're like, I'm working harder than I ever have before, but I love it and it feels easy.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Okay, so just a couple last questions to finish up, Chris. Number one, as someone who, and I ask kind of all my guests this one, and mostly I've been asking you in multifamily, but I'm going to give you the world to answer this one. Especially with your experience in artificial intelligence. I mean, you've got a company that has AI in the name.
That was a mistake. Yeah. We really shouldn't have, because we named the company a couple years before this whole thing took off, and now that it takes off, I get like 700 LinkedIn private messages every day. Like, do you need to raise money? Do you need to hire people? Do you need to get leads? And I'm like, why is this happening? I've never had this before. I've been doing this 25 years. And they're like, oh, it's because AI is in the name of the company.
So where are you most excited about seeing AI in general go? Where's the positivity about Reddit?
Well, in the world of multifamily, everything is data.
Yeah.
Everything is data. You don't get paid off the person that is, sitting in the apartment, right? You get rent. I'm not against that. But the majority of the money, where the risk plays out, right, and where the good companies make it and the bad companies don't, is all the stuff that happens in between the renter and the property, right? So you have this, like, okay, if it takes me 6 months to lease a property and someone else, it takes them 6 days, they're making more than I am, right? And if I get the person who leaves pays all their bills before they walk out, and the other one not only didn't get paid, but also lost the furniture, right? So the magic, right, happens in between the stays rather than what's happening in the stay. Now, again, you might have some people who have crazy amounts of work orders, and then you're like, okay, we got to mitigate that. But that's still data. And so at the end of the day, everything you can do with data up front and on the back end, some in the middle, all of that will help you become a more profitable company without, right? Oftentimes we think of, especially in a case where you're trying to serve a community and all that, you're like, well, it's profits or people. And you're like, no, this is beautiful because this is profits and people. Yeah. Like there's no conflict inherent in using data in the in-betweens, right? And so if you look at what happens before they move in and what happens after they move in, what data are you collecting? And what you discover is most organizations collect some data. No one looks you square in the eyes and says, we're collecting all the data, every bit of data we could. And so you go, okay, well, let's collect more data. But if someone did show up and say, we've collected all the data, they can't still look you in the eye when you say, what are you doing with it?
Exactly.
Because then they're like, nothing, right? And so the real beauty of AI, right, especially over the next few years as we see this, is you can take all that data, load it into what used to be hire a data scientist. I can load it into a Claude or a ChatGPT or an Anthropic, any of these tools. I can load it in and then have it find correlations, have it find insights. You're leasing more properties to people who come from out of state than you are from people who are local. What is this news? Why? Well, because you're in Chicago, you're not in Milwaukee, and in Chicago, this is that. And you're like, great. So then, does that mean I need to advertise in broader than the metro area? And so all of a sudden, it changes how you make decisions and what moves you make. But you got to use the data. And unfortunately, the problem is that collecting that data, where did you come from, or how did you find us, or often is really anemic. It's little, and then it's never. No one's going to look at 10,000 records and go, okay, what's the correlation? It's too dispersed. It's too distributed. It doesn't come in a nice, pretty package. Now you just take all that junk and you just go throw it into an engine and say, hey, look for this, look for that. These are the kinds of things I would like to know about. Look for these things. Any insights you have, and you have to learn how to write the prompts. I mean, it's not that anybody can walk in and do it, but it's way easier. So in Motivation AI, I don't have a data scientist. When I was at LiquidWeb, we had a data scientist. When I was at Emphasis, which was in property management, but for public housing, we had to hire a guy. You had to pay $100,000 to $200,000 a year to have a dude running complicated algorithms in Excel. And now I do it at Motivation AI with no one. You just throw data in, tell it what you're looking for, right? Tell it kinds of things that would be interesting, and have it come back out. So I think that's where it becomes really interesting. Is we have a lot of organizations that have collected some data. They stopped collecting more data because they didn't know how to use the data that they had. Now you say, collect more, and let me show you how to put it to use. And that becomes really interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. Your commentary in that, especially when you're talking about, hey, we're having more applications from out of state than in state, et cetera. Candidly, I've seen it before from the organizations I've been. And it brings me right back to where we started, which is ironically, a lot of organizations from that perspective work very hard in silos.
Yeah.
The marketing team is looking at all the conversions, which you can define that word 1,000 different ways, but they're not equating it to, okay, where did that person come from? Should I be changing my geofencing because of that? And that's where that breakdown of the silos and thinking more like a generalist.
Yes.
Ironically, we're getting more specialized, but I need that person putting in the prompts
Yes.
to think like a generalist to be able to get those particular answers.
That's right. And you might discover other things, right? You might discover that tall people have less work orders in your system than short people. And you're like,
no, because we're not going to look at the actual person themselves, because at least a fair housing thing.
Definitely
we're not doing that.
But I'm just saying, there are things where you're just like, how did we not know that we're having more work orders from people that are older or younger or taller or short? And you're like, well, it turns out, the property is built in a certain way that and you're just like,
so I'll give a real example of this. This was years and years and years ago. I was with an organization where we looked at work orders and asked the question, okay, is there any predictability, or I should say correlation, between work orders, particularly the number of types of work orders, and someone's propensity to renew? And the first finding wouldn't surprise anybody. The person who was the least likely to renew was the person who put in the same work order multiple times, and you never fixed it.
Yep.
What was surprising, though, was the one that was the second most likely to renew was the person who never put in a work order.
Yeah.
They had no ownership. It was a box to them. It was 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. They didn't care. I guarantee something went wrong in that apartment for a year. You're not that good. Like, nobody is that good. Yeah. So it was interesting to see that was that correlation.
So my first job in college, we got a CDBG grant to do minor home repair in the community, and we had to report all of the repairs we did, right? This was free repairs to anyone in the community.
Sure.
And my job was the data guy. So I collected it all back in the old days and made spreadsheets and pulled it all together. And we could tell you, right, how many home repairs were going to come out of which different properties based on who owned the property, right? Based on who owned the property. Because who owned the property, in a college town, it's not like there's 7,000 owners of 7,000 units. There's 4 owners of 7,000 units, right? These companies that basically were like, we're going to buy these apartments and they're going to buy the multifamily all over. And then they put them out. And different companies had different approaches to preventative maintenance and So once we put in this, I'd be like, okay, we're getting to the end of this quarter and we need to pop these numbers, right? I think the statute of limitations is long past due, so I can tell you the story.
We're not saying any names.
Yeah,
you're not even saying
what city I was in. But if we need to pop the number, we need 16 more to hit a bigger number this quarter than last quarter. I'd be like,
as far as service requests,
I'm like, I'll just call these 3 properties because they're owned by this owner, and I'll even seed the kernel of the idea of hey, do you need us to install smoke detectors? And they were like, oh my gosh, we do. And then I go check, and hey Bill, we got 27 smoke detectors that need to be installed, right? In the next 2 days. He's like, love it, those are easy, right? He does it, and you're like, how did you know that? And you're like, because we've pulled in all the data, done all the analysis, and we can tell you that different property management companies were functioning differently, and they cared about different things more than others, right? And so you're like, oh, it's all predictive modeling, right? So the AI, with the right amount of data and an AI engine, it can be really interesting.
Well, and I think the predictive modeling is really interesting because it is one of the areas where AI and automation, and definitely the way that we build the specialization, is really starting to focus is the maintenance side of the equation. Yeah. So that predictive modeling is one that I think is super interesting because, again, especially for preventive maintenance. Yes, we know that we changed the smoke detector batteries on these 2 dates, and we changed the filters on these 2 dates, the air filters. But what about all the other things that possibly could be potentially going on? We could be paying attention.
And if you're a national organization, right, you just create one policy. Yeah. Hey, we replace the air conditioning units every 20 years. And then you're like, well, shouldn't we look at what's happening in Detroit versus what's happening in Boston versus what's happening in Cincinnati? I mean, these are
versus product type versus manufacturer.
Yeah,
versus
exactly.
model.
I mean, right? Like, shouldn't we? And then you might end up with a more nuanced preventative maintenance schedule, right? And we tend to think, well, yeah, that's just more complicated. Let's just do it simple. But you're like, it's not complicated to the feet on the street. I'm only in Boston or I'm only in Cincy. I don't need to worry about that. Just tell me what makes sense for us here to have the best approach. And you're like, yeah, we can do that with data.
Okay, so last little bit of questions, and I'll preface this with a little bit of a story. I was talking recently with Mike Wallings, who guys on this call will know with 30 Lines. He's a marketing shop and a WordPress shop, etc. Knows WordPress, knows this kind of thing. So I was asking him at the end. I said, okay, is there anything I can do for you? Like, how can I serve you? I think is how I mentioned it. And he straight up looks at me and goes, I want to bring CaboPress to multifamily. So this is my shout out to Mike for that one. We're obviously, we've mentioned a couple of times, we're here in Cabo. We're here not just for vacation. We're here for a conference. Describe for our listeners what CaboPress is and why it's important to be able to have this type of an interaction with your peers.
So CaboPress is a business conference. Even though almost every single company that comes here is a technology company, in one way, shape, or form or another. But it is a business conference. So we're talking about business topics. It is for the business owners. So companies, product companies, agencies, digital agencies, the people that are doing services, product services, and SaaS, people that have hosted models. And it's the top executives. It's not the underlings in that company, right? And the reason is it turns out everybody, right, has some of the same problems, but they all feel alone. Why? Because you can't tell your buddy who's not in your business about the nuances of your business because he's bored. You can't tell your employee what's going on because you just scared them and they're start looking for a new job. You can't tell your competitors that you're struggling in something because they're going to, eat you up. So you have no one to talk to. Maybe your spouse is like, I get it. She doesn't
want to hear anymore, trust me.
She doesn't want to hear it, right? So you have no one to talk to. So I curate these owners and bring them in together and create a space where they can connect. The other dynamic that plays out is, as a business coach, if I walk up to you and I go, Andrew, everything you're doing at LeaseLock is wrong. Well, LeaseLock's your baby. You don't want to hear from me that you're if I was in a coaching call in the middle of the week somewhere, you're not interested, right? So I've been coming here for 10 years, and then I said, I just come from a conference where I thought this conference was horrible, and my wife is asking what made it horrible. I'm listing all the things that made it horrible, and I said, I think I'm going to create my own conference, and I'm going to do everything that's opposite of what they do over there, and all this stuff. And I go, but the biggest deal is most people put all their walls up if you go to give them a critique of their business. If I say, hey, I love what you're doing, I think you're great, but I think you're missing this opportunity, you're going to get defensive. But if I put you in a 5-star resort, give you unlimited food and drink, put you in a pool,
where all the sessions are,
right? All the sessions are in pools, and they're not even lectures. They are group discussions.
Yeah.
The host moderates 20 minutes of insight, and then it's a Q&A. So it's a conversation. If I unlimited food, unlimited drink, 5-star resort, in a pool, in the sun, you start relaxing. And then I say, hey, let's talk a little about LeaseLock. And I had this idea of a way you could improve. And you're like, give it to me. Because people don't change when they are back against the wall, defensive walls up. They don't even hear. But when people relax, walls come down. And then you say, I don't know if you'd be interested. They're like, please tell me. And you give them the idea. So every one of these people that's come for the last 10 years, right? We've done it for 11 years, 10 conferences because COVID hit one year and we canceled. But 10 conferences where people have gone home saying, first of all, I feel more relaxed than ever. And second of all, I have ideas to change my business, 1 or 2 or 3, but change my business. And the thing that you and I both know is if I send you an email to say, hey, Andrew, I want to do a deal. I want to do a partnership. I want to do a joint venture. I want to do whatever. And you've never met me and it's just an email, but we both know someone, 50% shot that goes, 50% it doesn't, right? Yeah. If we don't know someone in common, 90% it doesn't go, 10% it does. But if we've sat in a pool together and hung out for 4 or 5 days and we've had good conversation, and then I'm like, hey, Andrew, I was thinking we could do this thing together. We've had joint ventures, we've had partnerships, we've had acquisitions, we've had new products, we've had service deliveries where they combine a service company and product company together. We've had all of that over the last 10 years because people face-to-face connected with someone and had a real honest and legit conversation. No cameras, no recordings. So
no vendors.
No vendors. What's said here stays here. But it creates a community of people. We've had more than 500 people come through, and we only bring about 50%. So in any class, it's about 50 to 60. And so we only bring about 25 back. So they're jonesing to come back, right? And how do I get back? How do I get an invite? It's all invite. You apply and it's invite only. But you're like, no, we're constantly curating for the right group and the right host to come in and create this really special conference. The conference only goes from 9 to 12, the sessions in the morning. So nobody gets overtaxed. We've all been in those conference rooms that go until 5 or 6. And you're like, I don't even remember what I wrote in these notes this morning. So we don't exhaust you that way. We give you a constant lunch group that allows you to debrief as you're going through the event. We've seen people take that group, once the conference is done, and they've stayed together once a month for a whole year. So we've tweaked lots of little things to make it the conference that destroys you for all other conferences. Every year I get people that go to another conference and they take pictures and they send it back to me and they go, this is no CaboPress. And I go, yeah.
It is definitely a different experience. And I appreciate you allowing Joy and I to come for so many years because it's a big part of what we do from a personal perspective. We love being a part of it. Chris, I appreciate your time. I know we're keeping you away from the conference right now, so we want to make sure we get back. But appreciate your time, appreciate your insights. For someone who might be more interested in learning more about you, more about MCode, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I am at Chris Lema, Lema, on Twitter. And I am at motivationcode.com is the website. I also have my own website at chrislema.com, so you can find me anywhere there.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Appreciate you, brother.
Thanks, buddy.